Hello and welcome to Eavesdropping at the Movies. I'm Mike.
And I'm José.
And today is an interesting one-off. We've been to see a sort of special event film that's touring the country. There's only one copy of it. There's not even a digital copy. It's this one copy on 35mm film, and the more it gets shown, the more it degrades, and once it's gone, it's gone. It's called The Afterlight. And it's made by this director who's a young fella, seems to be around my age, I'd have thought.
He looked young, whatever age he is, yeah.
Yeah, called Charlie Shackleton, formerly known as Charlie Line. He changed his name. And weirdly, I'd heard of him because he did this film about 6 years ago called Paint Drying. And this kind of made the press. It was this sort of protest against censorship and the amount of money it costs to get a film classified in the UK. So he filmed paint drying on a wall for about 10 hours and raised funds on Kickstarter. Because the longer a film is, the more it costs to get the BBFC to classify it. You have to pay for it. And as a protest against this, he went, right, I'm going to make them watch paint drying. They got to watch the whole thing. And then eventually they classified it as universal. So it's suitable for all ages, paint drying. Anyway, that made the press, and I remember that. And I didn't realise, I didn't realise anything else about him. But he makes kind of documentaries and things based on sort of found footage and archival footage. This has a similar rubric to The Clock, which was kind of, it's all about one thing. Remember The Clock, that 24-hour film, which was about telling the time, and all the shots had to have clocks in them. The idea of this is all the shots have only people who are deceased now in them. It's this kind of memory of all these people. There are lots of actors that you recognise. There's Humphrey Bogart, Barbara Windsor, Sid James, Setsu Kahara,
Louise Brooks, Burt Lancaster, John Garfield.
But it's not to say it's not full of stars. And in fact, in the Q&A after the film, he talked about not wanting to choose the most famous clips because that would distract from what the film was doing. That you'd see this iconic clip.
Yes, but there's a difference between not choosing stars and not choosing the most famous scene of famous films.
Yeah, absolutely.
So because it's full, the film is chock-a-block with stars.
It is. But it's also chock-a-block with lots of people that you've never heard of because actually most people in films are in the background and you don't know who they are, and and a lot of effort has been put into finding out who these people are and making sure that they're no longer alive, which is kind of the point of the thing.
I would say I recognise like 80% of them.
Sure. But all the people in the background in the bar scenes.
No, well, true, and they were named, but actually, even when you read the list of credits at the end, there were quite few that I didn't recognize the name of.
Yeah.
And those were mainly like, Japanese or Indian or...
Yeah.
Which is one of the things of the film I thought was really good at.
Yes, in fact, I don't want to go on about it, but one of the criticisms that we had of The Clock was that of all the films it was choosing from to build this 24-hour piece, it was very much choosing from the canon and very much choosing from Anglo-American cinema.
Well, Anglo-American film culture, because it also had a few Japanese things and so on, but the obvious suspects,
Yeah, like Ozu and a couple of French, Truffaut. This is doing much more by way of trying to pick from a wide range of cinemas and cultures.
I was very surprised to see the amount of Mexican films, and actually, I wanted to ask about that because, there are clips from all of the greats of Mexican cinema. Alfredo de Córdoba, Maria Felix, Dolores del Rio, they're all there, right? And, kind of, that takes some viewing. I mean, they're not instantly accessible here, those films, I mean, they might be in the Criterion Channel or something like that now, I suppose. But I think even so, they're not, I mean, I did a whole thing on Maria Felix, and the films were hard to find, So, so it takes some searching to find those films. And I thought I really liked the composition of the film in a way because it was so inclusive of unexpected, national cinemas or, stars from other cinemas or things like that.
Yeah, and I should quickly say, actually, because I've mentioned a film that's 24 hours long and a film that's 10 hours long, this is neither of those, in case that gives you the wrong impression. This is a film that's 82 minutes long.
Yes.
And like I say, John Shackleton is touring the country with it. This, I think he said, was its 22nd screening. And you could start to see some degradation on it, although he said, mostly that stuff I would see and you wouldn't, because it's still... I'm the only one who's watched it so many times. But there's a point in the film where there's a blackout, and the impression I got was that would have been originally pure black, with no scratches or anything, and there were a few. And there was a little bit of... And in the Q&A afterwards, he was talking about how he kind of thinks of it as like dancing and the marks that other people's eyes have left on it, that sort of thing. So the film is a film on its own terms, but it's also everything around the film and why it's been made, and the fact that it's touring and the fact that it's going to be seen so many times.
Can I say something? Because
yeah.
So just to pick up at your introduction, to make it clear for our listeners, this has a concept, really, and the concept is that it's on film only. Film degrades, so you're watching something in the process of degradation, and every viewing of it will be different. Moreover, what you're watching are dead things. People who are already dead. So, and part of the romance of cinema is that it's death. Yeah, it's like you have like this imprint of light on celluloid that's brought to life by light, the light of the projector, but that is of something that no longer exists, that once existed. Yeah, and that this is just the light, the shadow, the reflection, the phantom. So the deadness of it is part of what cinema is. And the film makes that a kind of a conscious project. That this is what the film's about, the afterlight.
It's a wonderful title. It's a really brilliant title.
And my feeling on it was that what I loved was the concept and the idea. And, Shackleton's witty, articulate, modest, inclusive way of talking about the film. Because he's very charming. In a quiet way. But I must also say that I liked that whole thing better than the film itself.
Yeah, I do kind of know what you mean. One of the questions that someone asked in the Q&A was, how did you know when it was finished? So the film has a kind of very generalised narrative. You start off with shots of people walking, and they're from all different films, and clearly kind of this is something that over all of his viewing and taking in all of this material, he's noticed a kind of commonality, something that can be built out of this. People walking, and you start to build a question of where are they walking to, what's their feeling, what are they doing. After a few minutes, they start to enter a bar, and the one shot that is not archival, that was actually taken for this film, is a shot of a bar called the Afterlight, which has been set up for the title. And it has this kind of noirish thing, or this establishing shot of the bar. And after that, people are in the bar, and we see, again, lots of shots from lots of different films of people having drinks, chatting, whatever it might be, engaging in stuff in the bar. And this kind of commonality, again, is brought out of a lot of different material. And as the kind of the essentially the night wears on, in this very generalised narrative, we see different commonalities brought out from different things. But this person was saying, how do you know when it was finished? In thinking about kind of, you could just keep adding material to this. You could make the film 24 hours if you wanted. There is definitely enough material in the history of cinema to do that.
Keep people walking forever.
Yeah, you could do that. So, and I think that kind of it goes to what you're saying about the idea is stronger than the film, in that why exactly this shot has been chosen, or why exactly we've had this much of this material before moving on to the bar, before moving on to people going home, is it doesn't seem really strongly motivated.
I thought, because, well, at least my mind is immediately geared towards making sense of what it is that you're seeing, right? So you're looking for things, right? Like, so people are walking, where are they walking to? First there's this person walking, that person walking, what is connecting them? Well, you think a certain rhythm, they're walking in the same direction. Yeah, but what does that mean, that they are following the same rhythm and walking in the same direction? Yeah, is it just about how it's making you feel? But if it's just about how it's making you feel, then they change direction, they go into the bar. Like, yeah. So I couldn't quite make sense of it. Like, I didn't know, I mean, it's not that I was expecting a plot or a narrative necessarily, but even in terms of the rhythms, the only thing that I was getting was that the rhythms changed. Yeah. And my real pleasure was in seeing the stars.
Yeah.
which I think a lot of people probably wouldn't have recognized it because they're not the type of cinephile that I am.
And also because the films generally have to be so old that there's less chance of you knowing them, because the films have to be so old that people are dead.
Yeah. But, what he was saying is he wanted people to experience it anew, to see how people walked, how people held the glass, what people's faces were like, how people responded. To me, I think that's cinema. That's kind of, we don't need this particular film to bring that out. That has, been the interest in cinema from the beginning. It's always been my particular interest, right? Kind of, to see people being. Yes. And actually, the thing about cinema is that you're always watching people being without you being watched. So there's a freedom in looking. Yeah, you can really pay attention, either in a sexual way, these lips, Tom Hardy's lips, drive me wild, or just someone's gait. Yes, So actually, you're free to look, right? They're not looking back at you, right? And also, if you're interested in human behavior and in observing and things that you can't do in real life, because like you'd be kicked off the bus or whatever. Yeah, but that has always been, you don't need an experimental film to draw your attention to that. That is where your attention goes in films anyway.
Yeah, he talks about the idea of these things being a kind of preservation of moments of performance and bringing that out. But you're right, that is what cinema is. It's about preserving performance, and it's to a certain end. In the Q&A, he talked about a scene he used of Lon Chaney in The Wolfman, and it's how in the original film he's scratching all over and he's thinking, I'm turning into the Wolfman. But without that context, and particularly without the score, he talked about getting rid of the scores in the clips he used. He talks about the performance becoming something slightly different, and it becomes about. I think for him it's about, because he developed this kind of archivist's eye, and not just in this, but over I think all the work he's kind of done. He sees it both as Lon Chaney as the character of the Wolfman, but it's also like, we're looking at Lon Chaney in 1920 whatever it was, recorded. It's like this is the moment that he was acting, if you see what I mean. And I can sympathise with why that would be interesting to him, but I don't think it's something that particularly comes across. And I think you're right in that essentially what he's trying to preserve and make interesting for us is what is already interesting about cinema.
Yeah. I mean, this thing about in the film Lon Chaney, in any film, if you cut at a different place, the meaning of the thing changes.
Yeah.
If you cut the shot, it changes. If you put another shot before it, it changes. That's the nature of film editing.
Yeah.
Right? Again, it seems so I don't want to put it down, because in some ways I enjoyed it also. But you see, I think the concept is kind of brilliant. Yeah, or it's seductive anyway. But I think there's also an element of banality to me in the project.
Yeah.
Right? Because it is dealing with the obvious elements of cinema. Yeah, historically. And he was also saying archival footage. And I'm saying, well, what does it mean? And actually, what was revealed is he's just doing what all of these video essays are doing. He's using found footage, right? Because, I think when he was pressed in the questions, he wasn't going to some archive and digging up, celluloid canisters or whatever. No. He actually made a point of saying these are materials that are easily available.
Commercially available.
That are commercially available.
Yeah.
Right? So really, kind of, I thought there was something also Ponce about kind of the term of archival film. Yeah. Yeah.
I think the work has to then be more transformative than it is in order to be, valuable. Do you know what I mean?
Well, or that the footage is more original, hard to find, or rediscovered, or, kind of archive to me has, those connotations. I mean,
I think that might be a word that we're kind of putting on it, though. I'm not sure it's a word that he used. And as you say...
Well, he talked about the archival film. It's an archival film.
Did he?
Yeah.
Okay.
Because that was going to be my question to him that I never got around to asking. Right. What do you mean by archival film?
Right. Okay.
So, I kind of... Anyway, I think what I loved about the film, or about the experience of watching the film, was to see it on celluloid, to see it in that context. I thought the images were very vivid. There is something about being projected. Yeah, to me it had a different quality. And he said one of the things he wanted to draw attention to was the difference in the quality of the prints. Mm-hmm. Yes, what you saw. Yeah, some are very degraded prints, some are very pristine prints. But actually the overall effect seemed kind of magical to me. Yeah, and I'm attributing that to the celluloid and the projection. It, of course, it also has to do with the rhythms that he creates.
Yeah.
And his choices, right? Because they're very subaltern choices. Yeah. He could have made, for example, choices of dancing or something instead of choices of people drinking, right? In dives, right? And yeah. So I like the feel and the ambience and the rhythm, but there was also something kind of, magic about the projection, yeah, that I liked. Though I must say, I looked at my watch. Yeah,
I have to say, and I really don't mean this as a criticism of the film, but I did nod off once or twice. And I honestly mean that's because it was such a peaceful place to be. Do you know what I mean? And I thought, oh God, people probably hear him snoring or something. And I was waking up as often as I sort of could because I was never so gone that I was just unconscious. But I was aware that at points there was just so little happening, or it was so quiet that that I was dropping off. That's how it goes.
I wasn't aware of you dropping off.
Well, that's good. That's good.
Well, that must mean I was more absorbed in the film.
Or I was very quiet about it.
Yeah.
But in fact, thinking about the reason that I was kind of dropping off, I think it has to do with the silence, and the silence came up in the Q&A, which I thought was really interesting. So he drops out the soundtracks of everything, the scores, that is. And in order to do that, what he does is he picks up sound from elsewhere in those films and moves it onto that clip. So the idea is to preserve, although it is an act of editing, the idea is to preserve what silence sounds like in this particular film. And you never think about that until you start to see lots and lots of clips concatenated in which silence is different between all of them.
Yeah, that's a brilliant point.
Yeah.
The different silences. That silence is...
Silence has a sound in film.
And that each film has its own sound of silence, yeah.
Was a really wonderful, beautiful idea. And also answered one of my questions that he answered it before I asked it, because one of the questions I had, although I did ask this in a way, was about the audio, and it's something that we brought up, in fact, when we saw The Clock as well, which was that the image is dealt with hard cuts, a hard cut from one thing to another between films, but the audio is used differently. It's used as a way to link them sometimes, or smooth between them. So the thing in The Clock was there was a lot of fading and mixing, and a lot of work had been done on the soundtrack that was kind of editorial. And that is something that's happening here in a slightly different way. So I did ask in the Q&A about a couple of points where he uses music that goes over several clips and joins them together. So there's a point where they'll put on a gramophone and they're listening to something, or a point where someone, I think maybe a band strikes up in a bar or something, and again music then plays over several clips and links them together. And I said, because that's you're talking about wanting to kind of preserve these films as they stand today and use them as they stand today, but that's an editorial decision to then play music over them. And he says, it comes from here. And I mean, essentially, it was an answer which I thought was quite reasonable and unexpected, which was to say it works better for the film this way. It gives things a little bit of cogency and a little bit of shape.
Sure.
And in fact, I'm sorry to keep going on about the comparison with The Clock, but it is something that I thought about in The Clock. And I remember when we spoke about how what I felt was quote-unquote filmmaking in The Clock, i.e. when it built something that was greater than some of its parts. So there was a point in The Clock which leads up to 12 o'clock midday where music from Run Lola Run is used, and it's kind of pounding techno and it's quite intense. And lots of clips from lots of different films are used that are kind of people waiting for midday, waiting for the time to run down. And it's like the film is chasing down midday. I mean, I remember feeling that was really good, right? Really smart bit of creative filmmaking that had built more out of the material than was sort of there to begin with. There are points in this where it does that, and particularly the point where close-ups of faces are used. Do you remember? Sort of maybe 2/3 of the way through the film, and I think there's music over the top of it as well. And lots and lots of close-ups of faces are used from, again, many, many different films, and it becomes completely not about what the people are doing at that point. It's not about them walking to a bar, it's not about them having dinner at home, it's just about what these people who are dead today look like preserved at the time that they were filmed, and it's very, very intense. And I thought, it strips away everything else that the film is doing. It makes it completely about the people that we're seeing, and they're reflected, they're ghosts now.
Well, I suppose that's true, but I don't see it as a positive thing.
Yeah.
Because I think one of the reasons why I think The Clock is, such a great work, whereas I don't think this one is because, in The Clock was funny, and it was suspenseful, and it was intense, and, it created all of these things with these clips and the central concept, yeah?
Yeah.
The film itself is a clock, right? Whereas, I thought this film didn't do much. Like, I didn't find any suspense. I didn't laugh. I wasn't scared. I did that, And, it's true that you're left with faces. But faces is what you're showing. So I think that should be the minimum thing.
Well, I just mean at that point, it seemed to have... I suppose that's, in a slightly roundabout and backhanded way, that is kind of what I'm saying, that I felt that was the point at which it was building something that was more interesting than the sum of its parts, which was that the intense focus on faces at this one point in the film, and the rapid cutting and all the shots of the faces were slowly getting closer to the face. The face was becoming a bigger component of the frame. So again, that was kind of intensifying. That was, I think, the one point in the film that I felt that something really creative and intentioned was being done beyond just kind of collecting shots of people walking, where, as you said, like, why is this film 82 minutes? Why it could be 50, it could be 200, just based on how many clips you're deciding to put in. It doesn't seem intentioned enough that it has to be this length and do this with what it's using.
I think the film is very clever, but again, to me this is like a backhanded compliment, in the sense that, it's merely clever. Yeah, that the concept is everything. Yeah, kind of, and he's very good at talking through that concept. And you listen to him talk and you're charmed and it's articulate and so on. But actually, I'm always extremely disappointed when you encounter a work of art and all that you're left with is a concept. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, it's like one of those painters that puts a Baudrillard quote in front of the painting, and really the significance is that the quote explains the painting, or gets you to look at the painting in a particular way or whatever, rather than the painting itself kind of doing the job, so to speak.
Yeah.
And I did think, so whilst I didn't dislike anything and I wasn't displeased by anything, it was a pleasant experience, and actually, the whole celluloid mood and so on I thought was kind of wonderful. I also think that there wasn't enough in the film. That, kind of a better artist or, someone kind of with greater ease and knowledge of, the effects that film can produce, would have done something richer with the same material.
Yes, it's a film that is a huge amount about the experience of being there. You have to be there, and it's live, and there is only this one copy. Which I think is important. I mean, actually, it was a very, very full screening at the Electric Cinema. So it's this one-night screening because the film then goes on tour to other places. I think I mentioned it to my brother, and I think he's going to go and see it when it comes to London in a few weeks' time. Don't quote me on that because I haven't looked at the dates, but that's sort of what he told me. But have a look at the website if it's coming around. I would suggest going to see it because it's a cinema experience. They're very much with a group of people all sharing this. And in particular, this one-off experience. It's not something that's going to show up on Netflix later on.
Don't get me wrong. I also recommend that people see it. Yeah.
But I think that. But it's not just that it's a recommendation for people to see it, but that is an important component of it.
Yeah, you have to. You have to see it. But I also think that's kind of precious, and I'm not sure I believe it. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure that if you've spent 2 years of your life, you don't have a digital backup, you don't have a print in your computer, you know, that you're just making this one celluloid print and that's it, that there's not going to be anything, you know.
You don't believe it?
I don't believe it.
I think if he has a digital backup of it, it's not something anyone will ever see. He just got it for himself.
Probably. But, you know...
But I think I can believe it.
Okay, well, you're a more generous-hearted man than I am. And he's also got this romantic thing of surplus films, that, you know, the head of the museum in Vienna talked about surplus films, that 90% of the films in the archive are films that will never be seen again. That only about 10% of the films are brought into circulation in some form, and that, you know, he thinks his own film is headed to be, well, you know, one of those 90% that, you know, will probably never be seen, and I'm sure that's true, you know. But I also can't imagine anyone spending 2 years of their life doing something and not having a copy.
I mean, even
for personal reference, I don't believe it.
The reason ultimately that I do believe him is because he came across as extremely earnest and means what he says.
Well, he came across as like very clever, very intelligent, kind of modest, listening, to people. Also incredibly clever and a bit forward, you know. It took him a nanosecond to start selling his T-shirts, right? So I don't believe...
Well, he sold them right at the end before he went.
No, but he stopped the conversation like, let me get those T-shirts out and here is my...
No, because she was about to say goodbye. She was winding up and he said, quickly, just before we go. Well, I have no problem with that.
That's not the point, you know, but I think someone, who kind of starts hawking the T-shirts like that is not going to be the kind of person who doesn't keep a copy of his film.
I have no problem with that, and I think that's ridiculous. Of course he wants to sell his T-shirts. Of course he wants to sell his bloody T-shirts. Comes out with a bit of merchandise.
I don't have a problem with him selling his T-shirts. I really, actually, had I been a bit more patient, I would have bought one. I like the T-shirts.
Yeah, it was a good T-shirt.
You know, and I don't have a problem with, people making a living. You know, I'm just saying, that it takes a certain kind of personality to kind of, do that so easily and so quickly. And, here's my sort code and, I prefer cash. I mean, there was a real ease with commerce. And I just don't believe that that type of person would not keep a copy of something they worked 2 years on.
Okay.
For this romantic notion that it'll all dissolve because there's one print. I mean, I think he'll say that. And there probably is only one celluloid print. But I don't believe he doesn't have something on his computer.
Okay. I believe him, And it costs nothing to believe him, quite frankly. So
yes, except the revelation of your innocence.
I mean, I don't think it's going to be a Boris Johnson level scandal.
No, of course not. And again, I don't want to give the impression that I'm judging this at all negatively. I'm just kind of, because I'm not. But I just think that a kind of person who's so at ease with the sale of his T-shirts would also not be stupid enough to not keep a copy of his own, of 2 years of work.
Yeah, but I mean, it goes... Look, I don't want to get into too big of an argument about this because I don't really
It's all
care.
Speculative. We don't
Well, it's all
know.
speculative and I don't really care. But the point is that it degrades and goes away and eventually won't be there. That's the whole point.
Yeah. That's the whole point of the one celluloid print.
No, but it's not just that. It's the point of it being the only version of this ever.
I know, but I'm just saying I don't believe that. I can't...
But I'm saying I don't know why... I just don't know why it's so difficult for you to believe that you could possibly...
Well, because I can't believe an artist spending 2 years of their life, with the possibility of keeping a reference to it, is chewing it.
I don't know. Artists have made stuff that goes away forever.
Well, that goes away against their will, that is never received, or that it gets lost, or it gets burned. But you often... the greatest tragedy that befalls artists is when they lose their manuscript. Whatever.
William de Kooning let Robert Rauschenberg destroy one of his pictures for art. Was it the KLF burnt £1 million with their own money?
I bet you that William de Kooning took pictures of that before.
I've absolutely not. Okay, you can bet me all you want, but
yeah. Anyway, maybe that has to do with my own cynicism and skepticism.
Well, it definitely it is cynicism, but and you're very perfectly entitled to say that I'm being too romantic about it. I just believe it. I find it quite comfortable and easy to believe that the guy means what he says.
Okay, yeah, I don't. Yin and yang. But let's not end on this note because, I did think the film conceptually has a wonderful central idea. As an experience, I enjoyed it. I found it romantic. I loved the mood that the whole thing set up. And really, he is an incredibly articulate and intelligent, and there's a kind of modesty and humor in the way that he interacts, that is very pleasing. He's the best advertisement for his work.
Yes,
And all of that was a great pleasure. I'm really glad I took part in it.
Yeah, I'm glad I was there. I'm glad to have seen it on this, one of its however many screens it's going to have, but it's the only copy, maybe.
Yeah, right.
But yeah,
I've got a bridge to sell.
you have to be there, and I'm glad I was.
Yeah, all right. Well, thank you very much for listening. We are eavesdropping at the movies, and we are on
Apple Podcasts, Audible, Google Podcasts, Spotify, SoundCloud, and YouTube. On social media, we're on Facebook and Twitter. And the website is eavesdroppingatthemovies.com.
Thanks very much.
Bye-bye. Also, thank you to the Electric for putting it on, which is where the event was held. It was a very, very full crowd. It was a proper event.
And more importantly, thanks to the Electric for continuing to maintain the equipment that makes such a screening possible. You can't screen 35mm film without a 35mm projector. Yeah, and, the Electric has to be one of the few places in the Midlands that continues to run one. So, greatly appreciated.